Being fungi, living groundwork, mycelium, mycelium. Growing like in stretching lifetime, stretching lifetime, dwelling becoming lichens of our own minds, of our own minds, of our own life. Becoming lichens of our own minds, of our own minds. Entangled life, entangled life, entangled life.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Auguste von Bayern, the chair of Biotopia Förderkreis, the Friends of Biotopia. And as a biologist, I'm passionate about life sciences. I'm standing here in the brand new Biotopia lab, which is ready for you to explore as soon as museums are allowed to open again. Our first pop-up exhibition is called Fungi for Future, and it's all about fungi and their relevance for nature and all living beings, but also about their tremendous potential for the future in the form of new materials for construction of fabrics. For example, see here this vegan sneaker made entirely from fungal leather. So I can't wait for you to be here and Biotopia Lab to open. For the meantime, we have an exciting fireside conversation planned with the famous biologist and author Merlin Sheldrake. And he's going to have a conversation with Professor Michael John Gorman, our founding director of Biotopia. Enjoy.
Thank you, Augusta, and hello, everyone. And you're very welcome to our first Biotopia event of 2021. And we're thrilled this evening to have a very special guest, Merlin Sheldrake, author, biologist, and the author of this wonderful new book, Entangled Life, which has just appeared. It's kind of camouflaged with a virtual background. You can just see it there. Also available in German as Verwobenes Leben and published by Ullstein Verlag. My name is Michael John Gorman, and as Augusta said, I'm the founding director of Biotopia in Munich, and it's great to be speaking to you from our Biotopia lab. So, Merlin, you're a biologist, as we've heard. You had your PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University. You've studied plant sciences, microbiology, ecology, and also history and philosophy of science in Cambridge. And you've been researching underground fungi in Panama and tropical forests, fungal networks, and you've also been looking at the history of Amazonian ethnobotany and all sorts of fascinating subjects, such as the relationship between sound and form and resonant systems. And you also have a very strong personal interest in fermentation and a practical interest in fermentation and brewing, I understand. So I hope we'll get onto that later. But before we dive into that, and I have to say I really enjoyed reading this book. It's a treasure trove of wonderful stories about fungi and mycelium. And I would like to ask you maybe how you got gripped with this fascination for fungi originally. How did you get the bug?
Well, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here at the Biotopia lab. And there are so many ways in for me. One of the ways in was my fascination with decomposition. As a child, how do things transform from one thing into another? Now, how does the compost bucket you empty in the garden, the compost heap, how does that turn into soil? How do rotting leaves rot? And who oversees these processes? And you can't ask questions about decomposition for long without someone explaining to you about fungi, these organisms that live their life largely out of sight, but which are responsible for so much. So that was one way in. Another way in was through symbiosis. I became increasingly fascinated by symbiosis as my biological studies progressed, and these different ways that organisms are continually inventing to live alongside one another. And I just found this such a fascinating notion. And I love these ideas, these relationships. And so, again, you can't think about symbiosis for long without bumping into fungi, who are key players in some of the big symbiosis that have shaped life on this planet. So that was another route in for me.
I was very interested in your family background is quite unusual. You have your father is probably known to many people, Rupert Sheldrake, a controversial figure in scientific circles for his research on the paranormal and on then your brother Cosmo Sheldrake is a successful musician and also using a lot of natural sounds in his recordings. And I mean, in a way, he's interested in composition, where you're very interested in decomposition. I wondered, did that family environment really influence your interest in the natural world, and how did that stimulate you?
Definitely. My father's an amazing student of the living world, and growing up with him, we were always encouraged to ask questions about what was happening around us. And we'd have tadpoles and watch them change into frogs, and we had animals and we had plants growing in the house, and we'd spend a lot of time outdoors. And he's a very good teacher and very good at feeding curiosity. So for sure, this played a big part in my interest in the living world and my decision to study the biological sciences. Yeah, I mean, the joke with Cosmo is our mother jokes that I'm a musical biologist and he's a biological musician, and it's a lovely thing to be able to play together in different ways.
And he, of course, is responsible for the jingle that we heard, the mycelium jingle, which is very catchy, that we heard at the beginning of the discussion, while seeing this amazing image of your book blossoming with oyster mushrooms, perhaps?
That's right, yeah.
So a good experiment. I wonder, have you considered sending out oyster mushroom packs with the book for people to grow their own?
I mean, that would have been great to be able to do that. My publishers actually sent out grow kits with the book to some people to feed their curiosity, but I haven't been able to do it as much as I'd like to.
Yeah, I mean, there are many amazing facts in the book that may surprise people. For example, I was curious to see that we're more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. Than they are to plants, than fungi are to plants. So, I mean, often fungi and plants get lumped together, also as in research institutions, an area of study, but we kind of maybe forget our kinship with fungi. Also, that fungi are the largest living organisms in the world. But it seems, and you make this case strongly, that we know very little about them and they're often neglected. But why, in your view, why do we really need now to focus more on fungi?
I think there are a lot of reasons. One of the reasons we need to focus on them is because of our neglect. Because of our neglect, we know comparatively little about the fungal world. And there's a number of reasons why I think we've tended to neglect them. One of which is a problem of access. These technological tools that have arisen in the last few decades really give us new abilities to investigate the microbial world, the hidden world. I think we need to understand them or learn more about them, partly because of the great role that they play in shaping life on Earth, both in supporting the ecosystems that sustain us, whether as decomposers, recycling this organic matter, which would otherwise be layered kilometers deep over the surface of the Earth, and in part in sustaining plant life, which of course lies at the root of the terrestrial biosphere, these trophic systems that underpin everything we depend on. So it would be it's inconceivable to the prospect of a planet with no fungi is I find inconceivable. And because they hold together so many of these living processes, because they're kind of ecological connective tissue, these mycelial networks string their way through ecosystems, and they form literal connections between organisms. And so I think of them as these, as this kind of living fabric holding together these life systems. And so if we don't think about them, if we don't learn more about them, then the chances are that we'll continue to be blind to them, and what we're blind to, we'll most likely destroy or at least take for granted. And we just can't afford to do that in this case.
Mm. And you talk a lot in the book about the coevolution of terrestrial plants and trees and fungi, and also a lot about mycorrhizal networks, which are a really important concept for people to really understand that. I mean, people often think that the fungus is the fruit above the ground, but really that's only what meets the eye. I mean, maybe can you say a little bit more about what mycorrhizal networks are and why they're important?
Mm-hmm. So the word mycorrhizal comes from the Greek, myco meaning fungus and rhiza meaning root. And mycorrhizal fungi are symbiotic fungi. It's a whole, there's lots of different ways of being a mycorrhizal fungus. Different lineages of fungi have found their way to this lifestyle by different evolutionary paths. But broadly speaking, the mycorrhizal lifestyle involves growing in or around tree roots. And the fungus then extends outwards into the soil and scavenges for nutrients, so phosphorus or nitrogen, besides water, which it then trades with the plant for energy-containing carbon compounds like sugars that the plant makes in photosynthesis. So they have a very intricately managed, mutually beneficial, on the whole, relationship of exchange. And this allows plants to get what they need to from the ground. And it also allows the fungi to get what they need to from the atmosphere, from the light and the carbon dioxide that the plants use to make the energy-containing carbon compounds in photosynthesis. And it's really important in the history of life because back about 500 million years ago or so, before plants had made it onto the land, the algal ancestors of plants living in fresh water, as they started to wash up onto the soggy shores of lakes and rivers and begin their passage onto land, they were faced with great challenges. Life on land, life in the open air, presents all sorts of problems to an organism which is used to living in the water. And one of those problems is acquiring nutrients, because in the water you're floating in a nutrient broth, nutrients come to you. But on land, you have to extend yourself into some kind of complex matrix, like the soil, and find the nutrients that you need there to survive. And when they washed up on land, the fungi were able to enter a relationship with them. The fungi benefited because they could photosynthesize, this foundational superpower of algae in plants. But the fungi then behaved as the root system of these early plants for about 50 million years, until plants could evolve their own roots. And even after plants had evolved their own roots, these mycorrhizal fungi continued to serve this role. So it's, when we think about plants, what we're really thinking about are algae which have evolved to farm fungi, and fungi which have evolved to farm algae. So it's an astonishing, an ancient relationship.
And you put this symbiotic relationship really at the center of the book. But one of my team actually asked the question, why are there so few fungi in the sea? And, we find a lot of fungi on land, but why aren't there more in the sea?
Well, there are actually lots in the sea. It's just very understudied. So there are fungi that live in sulfurous sediments, 100 meters below the surface of the sea. There are fungi that grow along through coral reefs. There are fungi that live in the shells of crustaceans. And there are fungi that live and help support the life of seaweeds. Many seaweeds depend on fungi that live in them and actually help them. A lot of the seaweeds that you see strewn across a beach at low tide, those can only survive this periodic desiccation because of the fungi that help them to do so. So fungi do have a big presence in the sea. It's just that they're underrepresented in the study of mycology. Yeah.
And did you have a video of mycorrhiza that you wanted to show?
Yes, this would be a good time to show that. Let me get this up. So this is a scan. This is just to give you a sense of the mycorrhizal association. So it's a root from I picked up in Panama in the tropical forest there, and I worked with some colleagues in Marburg in Germany.
Yes.
Very, very brilliant microscopists, and one of them, Magnus Rath, had devised this technique which allowed you to stain the plant, the root, to stain the plant and the fungal matter in different fluorescent dyes. And so then when you scan this using a laser microscope called a confocal laser scanning microscope, you scan slices, which you can then recombine later into a three-dimensional rendering, which is what I'm going to show you
Yes.
And you can travel around within the root, and you can turn the plant channel up or down to reveal the fungus within it. So what you'll see now is this, this journey in and around the root. The fungus is in red and the plant tissue is in blue. And you get a sense of how intimate this relationship is. And these fungi are actually growing within plant cells. This is no casual affair. And here we are, we travel inside the root. And so it's always amazes me to, I want to print these out as three-dimensional life-size models and make it sort of installation where people can clamber around inside these root structures to get a sense of this intimacy. I always want to just get closer to these.
I mean, it really comes to the heart of this idea of entangled life that you talk about in the book, and this really intimate relationship. And I suppose another concept that people have heard quite a lot about in the last few years is this idea of the wood wide web, and the idea that plants, trees are using mycelium networks, mycorrhizal networks to communicate, to exchange nutrients and so on. And sometimes people even go further and suggest that, you know, this is like a sort of external brain for the trees, but you actually point to the fact that there are these electrical signals traveling through these networks, and should neuroscientists begin studying mycelium networks as externalized brains?
Well, this is based on these very fascinating studies done in the mid-90s, which I discuss in the book. A researcher called Stefan Olsson at Lund University in Sweden. He had his next door neighbor in the neighboring lab was a neurobiologist studying moth brains, and he had this rig using microelectrodes, which you insert into moth brains, and you can detect the firing of action potentials. And so Olsson was trying to work out how fungal networks are able to communicate with themselves. And this remains a big mystery. How do these rambling, indeterminate networks continually remodeling themselves? How can they have a sense of where they are in space and in time? And so he stuck these electrodes into the mycelium, and he found that the mycelium also produced action potential-like impulses, which are responsive to stimulation. And so it's very possible, and so he found this in a number of different fungal species. Not all fungal species, the fungal species that produce longer-lived and larger, more extensive networks. The ones, in other words, that have a greater need for a fast communication system. So it's massively under-researched, and this is beginning to shift now, I hope. But it does raise all sorts of questions, of course. And we like to think about our neurological systems as some of the few electrical systems in the living world, but it's not actually true. And in the last few years, there's been an amazing resurgence of interest in electrical signaling in all sorts of organisms, from bacteria, which use rhythmic waves of electrical activity to communicate from one end of a bacterial colony to another. Again, an action potential-like phenomenon, to fungi. And plants, of course, have action potential-like activity too. And really, this is speaking to something, a very ancient property of biological cells, an electrical excitability, which long predates the evolution of brains. And so brains didn't evolve their tricks from scratch. And so these properties that we see, these properties of brains reflect these much more ancient processes. And brains have got really good at speeding up these electrical signals and complexifying the networks. But the properties of brains are not, in fact, unique to brains at all. So I think this is really good. It helps to decenter our human cognition and to see these cognitive processes as more finely distributed through the living world. I think it's good for our species narcissism.
Yes, and I mean, you have a particular interest, I think, in plants that hijack or even hack the wood wide web, and freeloaders, if you like, on this mycelium network. That I mean, you talked about symbiosis and how there's often a mutual benefit to the plant and the fungus, but you also talk about, for example, orchids, but also this Voirea plant, this flower that you studied in great depth. Could one even say that plants are sometimes parasitic on fungi, or would that be a misnomer?
No, that's totally fine to say. I mean, really, mycorrhizal relationships, like most symbiotic relationships, stretch along a continuum with a mutually beneficial state at one end of the continuum and parasitism at the other end. Parasitism being a situation where one partner benefits at the expense of the other.
Yeah.
And mycorrhizal relationships can slide along this continuum, and even one plant and one fungus, the same plant, the same fungus over a period of time, and they can sometimes the fungus might be giving more than it takes, sometimes the plant might be giving more than it takes, and so even just one pair of organisms can slide around in this symbiotic space. And so you absolutely can have situations where plants appear to be taking without giving back. In the case of these Voirea plants, it's assumed that they're parasitic because they have no chlorophyll, they have no green color, no leaves, no ability to photosynthesize, and so no ability to feed themselves.
Yes.
So it's usually assumed that they must, and because they're taking all of their nutrition from the fungal network, it's assumed that they're being parasites, but it's possible that they are returning the favor in some other currency that we haven't taken into account and haven't been able to measure yet. So one always has to be a bit careful when assigning these roles. But yeah, it's absolutely fine to think about this fluidity of symbiotic exchange.
And for you, I think an important organism, or if one can even call it an organism, is the lichen or lichen, and as really something which biologists like Lynn Margulis and others have really explored as a kind of a miniature ecosystem containing fungi, but also algae and sometimes bacteria and so on. And these kind of edge organisms, this discussion is really fascinating. I see we have a question actually about lichens in the Q&A, where Susanna Roth is asking, she's an organic landscape designer and she is starting to use lichens mostly on rocks in her designs, and is wondering how she can help propagate lichens so they grow into their spaces, and which lichens are the best to propagate on rock, and will they increase the radioactivity of the space they are in over time?
All good questions. Well, lichens grow very slowly, so it would actually be a very beautiful thing to start to feature in a garden and in design, because you have to take a long-term view, and so it would sort of implant this a need for patience into the design, which I think would probably be a very elegant thing. So it depends on the rock, it depends on the conditions, it depends on where you're growing the garden. Lichens are very sensitive to pollution. So if you're growing in an urban space, then there's some species that won't grow, and there are some species that are very hardy and will grow. So it's hard to give specifics without knowing more about the context, but yes, I think that's a really great idea. And I mean, in general, I think people can do more to help lichens. I mean, I have some friends in Canada, and they part of their fungal activism is if there's an area of forest that's going to be clear cut, they would take lichens from the area that's going to be cut, say an old growth area, and transplant these lichens into neighboring areas so that the lichens can persist even after the forest has been cut.
And what about the radioactivity? Should we be worried about?
I'm not sure if the lichens will. I don't know if the lichens will be able to deal with that. Some fungal species are very good at dealing with radioactivity. They've been found in the blasted reactors at Chernobyl, but not lichens to my knowledge.
Yes, yeah. And one of your heroes in the book is Beatrix Potter. And I hadn't realized that she was such an accomplished researcher in the field of, well, mycology and specifically lichens, and also did these extraordinary drawings of lichens and fungi, and they're really quite beautiful. You have some of them in the book. I mean, and perhaps if she was not excluded so much from the male-dominated scientific world of the day, we would never have had Peter Rabbit and such other favorites. But Beatrix Potter is also interesting because when one thinks of her stories, you know, where one has animals dressed up in clothes and so on, one thing, it's almost the archetypal idea of anthropomorphizing. Do you ever find the challenge when you kind of try to step into the shoes of the mycelium or the fungus, this risk around, I mean, scientists are often very concerned about the idea of anthropomorphizing their subjects and making nature too human-like. Do you ever feel that risk in your work and in creating these stories about these organisms?
Yes.
It's a complicated question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it feels like a good, I mean, it's a very important thing to discuss. I think we should all talk about this a lot more, because there's no easy answer, right? So, so one of the issues is, you know, so that we're all taught to be very suspicious of anthropomorphism for good reasons, because when we smother other organisms with human categories and human concepts, then it's hard to appreciate those organisms on their own terms, and so this is a very good reason for caution. But
Yes.
one of the problems is that when we, out of our great caution, it's often the case, at least in the natural sciences, that we end up mechanizing the world instead. We end up talking about living forms as automata, as kind of clockwork systems responding automatically or robotically to stimuli in their environment. And when we mechanize the world, I think we have a kind of cryptic anthropomorphism that we're bringing in, because humans are the only organisms to build machines. Machine language is a human thing. And so when we make the living world into a mechanized world, then I think we've just dressed it up in a different kind of guise. So I think more helpful is to try and deepen and expand some of our concepts so that they can include non-human organisms without any fuss. I mean, for example, when people talk about, say, the dog is feeling this way or a cat's feeling this way, and people say, oh, you're anthropomorphizing. Well, that's assuming that humans are the only organisms that can feel. So if your position is indeed that humans are the only organisms that can feel, then yes, then you're anthropomorphizing. But if you think, in fact, that dogs and cats can feel, and maybe they feel in a different way to us, but I mean, I think they undoubtedly feel, and I think probably most pet owners would agree, then all you're doing is expanding the concept of feeling. So I think this can be a really a healthy pursuit for us to start to grow and expand our terms, and to realize that many of the faculties that we possess are, of course, because we have evolved as part of the living world, and that these are found in other parts of the world and haven't just miraculously appeared in us de novo.
Yeah, no, I really think that's an important point, that I mean, that we fear anthropomorphism, and some biologists. One of our recent Biotopia events was actually with Frans de Waal, who you may know, who's done some really interesting work about emotions in animals and empathy in other mammals, particularly. But we have less of a fear of this idea of turning biology into machines and into mechanisms. And when one looks at how the discussions right now around synthetic biology, it's very much the engineering language of machines, and we assume that that's unproblematic, whereas you're absolutely right that that is in some ways just as problematic to transfer those metaphors to living systems as to interpret it as humans. There is a few very funny questions and interesting questions in the chat. One question is about the potential applications of fungi in the context of fighting climate change. Could they play a more prominent role as carbon sinks, for example? And my memory from your book was that actually it's more the opposite way, right? That many fungi are actually releasing carbon into the atmosphere.
So fungi play also, it's a whole kingdom of life, right? So there are so many ways to be a fungus, and so many ways to be involved with the global climate systems. So yeah, so decomposing fungi return a great quantity of carbon to the atmosphere every year, because they are enzymatically combusting organic material and returning CO2 to the air. But then lots of other fungi are contributing to carbon storage. So any fungus that is supporting the growth of a plant, for example, will be directly contributing to carbon storage. But perhaps most importantly is that the soil are a huge carbon sink. There's more carbon stored in the soil than in all plant material and the atmosphere combined. And much of the carbon stored in soils is bound up in tough organic compounds produced by fungi, and often by mycorrhizal fungi. And so, so there's a huge role for soil fungi in carbon storage. And that would involve us protecting these ecosystems from disturbance and destruction to allow that carbon to stay in the soil. So fungi have a big role to play, whether in direct sense, like storing carbon in the soil, but also in various indirect ways, like can we use fungi to disrupt oil-based or petroleum-based industries like the plastics industry by creating fungal materials that can replace those plastics. That's an indirect way to bring fungi into climate solutions. Can we use fungi to produce foodstuffs that can wean us off livestock, which are very high emitting farming systems? So there are lots of ways that fungi can help us deal with the problems that we face, which isn't really a surprise given how many aspects of the living world that they are bound up with.
Yes, and Augusta earlier showed the mycelium shoes, for example, using mycelia instead of leather, which is becoming such a big area at the moment. I mean, regenerative agriculture is also becoming very popular right now, and I suppose is also very strongly involving looking at topsoil and looking at topsoil as a carbon sink. And is that something that you believe has a lot of potential?
Definitely. And I mean, whenever we've conducted any kind of agricultural practice, for as long as we've done so, for the thousands of years we've done so, we've been farming fungi, and often without realizing it. You know, whenever you plant a plant, you're also planting the fungi that live in and around that plant. But the developments in industrial agriculture have really not taken account of the life of the soil. And so we've done a huge amount of damage to these microbial systems that live on plants. We've bred plant varieties with no thought to their ability to form healthy symbiotic relationships. So we've bred these kind of spoiled plant strains that work very well when you apply a huge amount of inorganic fertilizer, but they're actually not very good at forging relationships in the soil to engage in more healthy metabolic nutrient cycling with the rest of the soil population. So I think there's a lot we can do to bring a discussion of these microbes back into our agricultural stories and our agricultural processes.
Because in agriculture, fungi usually don't have the best reputation, right? They're more likely blights and pests. I wonder, are we kind of on the threshold of a moment when people think very differently, not just about agriculture, but even about gardening? I mean, you know, are we standing on the threshold of a new movement of fungal gardening, or you know, where people, as you say, think about which fungi will work symbiotically with which plants that they might plant in their gardens?
I think so. We're certainly, the world of mushroom cultivation is really booming, and all sorts of species which there's a great sort of underground scene, an amateur scene, amateur in the best sense of the word, people experimenting with different ways of cultivating fungi in different conditions on different substrates. And it's really booming, I think possibly like it never has before. Yes. And so this is really an exciting area of evolution, of co-evolution with these organisms. But also there are new twists based on our new technological abilities. There's a great study that came out recently, and there's a fungus called Sclerotinia, which forms a terrible blight of plants called watery soft rot, and it makes plants turn mushy and their leaves fall off. But it turns out that if you treat this fungus with a virus, if you infect this fungus with a virus, then not only does it stop becoming a pathogen, it no longer kills the plants that it lives on, but it becomes a valuable symbiotic partner, and it helps to support the growth and health of the plant. So you can vaccinate the fungus that lives with the plant to transform it. I think there's lots of this kind of discovery waiting to happen. And it shows you how fluid these categories are, and the dangers of just, that's a pathogen, which means that's the bad guy. It's like, well, actually, often we're creating the conditions for pathogens to flourish, and the pathogen is a symptom rather than a cause. And so we can step back and take a more ecological view and realize that actually there are some bigger systemic issues that we can transform.
Yeah, and I can't ignore any longer the top voted question in the Q&A, and I think it brings us into another interesting area. Hi Merlin, this is from Elena Breda. Hi Merlin, please explain your experience with LSD that you use to better understand the symbiosis that exists between the root and its mycorrhiza. I found it very interesting and fun as a part. So this is an important episode in the book. Let's hear.
Well, it was an amazing study. So there was a clinical study into the effects of LSD on the problem-solving abilities of scientists and mathematicians, and I was amused by this because it's I was recruited. There was a poster up in the Department of Plant Sciences, and so I saw it. It said, "Do you have a meaningful problem that needs solving?" And I said, "Well, yes, I do." And it said, "Call this number." So I called this number, and but it was a funny thing to be part of, because normally scientists spend their time looking at their experimental subjects, whatever they might be. It might be some physical system, a physicist, but as a biologist, you're looking at other living organisms on the whole. Sometimes they've been killed before you look at them, but on the whole, you're looking at living systems. And in this case, there was this funny setup where the scientists were looking at scientists. The scientists were the subject of the experiment. And so there was this, this very funny, unusual symmetry. And it was also amusing because they were trying to facilitate creative breakthroughs. And how do you facilitate a creative breakthrough in any situation, let alone in a hospital room? So there were these amusing aspects of this study, but in general, I thought it was very brave of them to take this on, and I had a lot of respect for them for moving forwards with this research. But I had a very interesting experience. I was given this LSD, and then
which itself derives originally from a fungus, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I found that very reassuring, that because we had to define our problems that we've been wrestling with. What are these? What's a research problem that you want help with? And so I was thinking about the relationships between plants and fungi, in particular these plants we were discussing, these Voria plants that have lost the ability to photosynthesize. So yeah, my fungal problems. This could be a fungal solution to my fungal problem, and so I had this very amazing experience. I mean, it was, the main sense was that I lived most of my life in a very small part of my mind, that my mind was in fact much larger than the part I normally lived in. It's as if I spent my time living in the garden, but at the end of the garden, there was a gate that led out into a big forest that was always there, but which I didn't really think about much, or didn't really explore much. So it was really an exciting experience to do this, and I think the main thing was just approaching old problems from new angles, giving a new perspective on things, loosening the grip of some of my certainties and some of my habits of thought, and allowing me to just stumble into the problem from an unusual angle, and see it from a different angle, and you think of new things when you see old problems from new angles. So it wasn't like the experience gave me new information, but more that it just helped me to loosen this knot in my inquiry by doing something different, by approaching it in a different way.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk a lot in the book about other types of hallucinogenic mushrooms, for example, different kinds of psilocybin fungi, and also their roles in different cultures. And I mean, that's something that I think you had connected with people like Terence McKenna and some of these key protagonists of psilocybin. But I'm also very interested in another kind of mind control by a fungus, which you discuss in the book, where you talk about the cordyceps and the fungi taking control over ants or over caterpillars and making them behave in very strange ways. And maybe you can say a little bit more about that, because it's a really fascinating area.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it's part of this bigger, a very ancient association between fungi and insects in general. And these these relationships going back tens of millions of years can take different routes. So some of these routes lead to these amazing sort of civilizations, you could think of them as, like leafcutter ants, which grow into, they have huge colonies and giant mounds, and they harvest leaves and they feed them to fungi, which they grow in enormous gardens in these mounds, similar with termites, macrotermes, termites in Africa.
Oh yes.
And so these are tens of millions of years old. These relationships, they're highly developed systems of agriculture, deeply beneficial for both partners. In fact, neither partner can survive without the other. But then there are other situations like the ones that you ask about, these situations where fungi have proved themselves to be devastating pathogens of insects, and with all sorts of colorful methods. And so the best studied example, the one you alluded to, this is a case of Ophiocordyceps. And Ophiocordyceps is a fungus that grows into the bodies of carpenter ants. And carpenter ants normally live their life at the low and the shady, hidden, safe zone on the forest floor. They don't tend to climb up high. Their instinct is to not climb up high. But when infected by the fungus, which starts to grow through their body, it overrides their instincts, and it gives them a great fascination with heights, a syndrome called summit disease. So the ants climb up the nearest stalk of a plant, and then at the right moment, the fungus impels them to bite onto the underside of a leaf in what's called the death grip. And at that point, the fungus then kills the ant and sprouts a stalk out of its head, from which spores rain down on unfortunate ants passing by below. And what's amazing is that this is really the summit disease, the death grip. These are fungal behaviors, not ant behaviors. These are behaviors that reflect the evolution of the fungus. And so you can think about these. David Hughes, who's a big researcher in this field, he describes an infected ant as a fungus in ant's clothing. These fungi, they don't have twitchy muscular bodies and the ability to walk and bite and fly. And so rather than go through the torturous process of evolving these abilities, they just commandeer an animal body to serve that purpose and toss it aside when it's done. It's a brilliant solution because the fungus is then free to continue with its indeterminate growth form and all of the freedoms, the developmental freedoms that fungi have, and get the benefit of an animal body when it needs it. So it's another of these situations where the ability to do this has evolved convergently in many different parts of the fungal kingdom. So many fungi have reached the same conclusion, but in different ways. And you have fungi that infect cicadas, that spiders, all sorts of different kinds of ants. It's a fascinating subject.
There is that one, is it in Tibet, the Yatsugumbo, or the one that is very popular as well as reputed to be aphrodisiac? But you know, that begs the question: if fungi are manipulating the minds of insects, would there be any evolutionary reason for fungi to want to manipulate the minds of humans?
Well, I mean, there are various reasons we could imagine. You know, whenever a fungus would want, whenever it would be in the interests of the fungus to have an animal serve its reproduction. And so, I mean, you can think about plants in this way. So if you think about plants' relationship with their pollinators or with their fruit dispersers, or in our agricultural relationships, when you have a big field of tulips and the proud tulip farmer standing next to the field of tulips, you might move to congratulate the tulip farmer, but you might as well congratulate the tulips as well for persuading a human, a powerful animal, to drop everything else, to dedicate their lives to planting the tulips in neat rows to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah, that's like chickens are the most successful bird in the world.
Totally. And so we're serving the needs of other organisms all the time. And so I can definitely imagine situations where it would be of, you know, of the evolutionary interest of a fungus to provide some kind of reward, to lure us into a relationship. And in fact, psilocybin mushrooms are a good example of this in recent years, since the middle of the 20th century, where they were discovered by modern science. And since then, a handful of tropical species of psychedelic mushrooms they've fallen into a new relationship of domestication with humans and now cultivated all over the world in warehouses, people's windowsills, under people's beds. And people are dropping whatever, they're changing their life to make space to learn how to grow these mushrooms in a way that they simply, the mushrooms would have no way to spread across the world like this without the help of humans who can create the perfect conditions for them to thrive. But of course, the humans wouldn't do this unless the mushrooms offered some reward. And the reward in this case is an astonishing psychedelic experience. Mm. So I think it's part of this bigger narrative of fungi and plants and animals falling into relationship and luring each other, meeting each other's needs, manipulating each other. It's a long evolutionary story.
Yes, I want to come back to some more of the questions in the chat. We have, or sorry, in the Q&A. So hi, Merlin and Michael. My question is, do you think there could be negative effects in meddling with the fungal world? Or is our present stance in ignorance more damaging to them? That's from Katerina Rusildi.
So, yeah, definitely potential for harm. I mean, it's the kingdom of life, right? So this is a huge fraction of the living world, and we can intervene in the fungal world in ways that will be harmful. For example, we already are by selecting for fungal pathogens, the drug-resistant fungal pathogens. Candida auris is a big problem. And it's arisen partly because of our liberal application of fungicides, creating the niche space for these pathogenic varieties to come in. And we've made that happen, that's a human creation. And that's come about both from our ignorance and at the same time our meddling in the fungal world, right? So our application of fungicides, our intervention in the fungal world, but also our ignorant application of fungicide, because without realizing that we're applying this fungicide, we're creating the space for these pathogens to evolve. So yes, it's very possible that we'll do damage, but I think the risks of knowing less, the risks of our ignorance are greater than the risks of further knowledge.
Yes, and so, if you get athlete's foot, should you think twice about administering anything to it or just let it be?
Well, I mean, we do have problematic infections that need treating. The question is which fungicide. But yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that everyone should let every fungus grow all over them.
Another question asking about the question of the concept of the human, and the question of in the book, partly around this topic of symbiosis, you kind of question the idea of the individual organism, and is this something that in some way applies to humans as well, that we need to think less rigidly about the human as an individual, in your view?
Absolutely.
I paraphrased a very long question there, but
yeah, I do take that view, and for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that we are symbiotic organisms. We have a gut, and all of our surfaces in our guts are filled with bacteria and fungi, without which we wouldn't grow and behave as we do. And these are no less part of our lives than our more familiar organs like our livers or our hearts. And so we do have to redraw the boundaries of ourselves to include the fact that we are carrying around more cells that are microbial than our own, which is an astonishing fact when you let it sink in.
Yes.
And
I heard research recently where they decided that it was pretty much equal, but a few times a day the balance shifts in terms of between bacterial and human cells, apparently.
Yeah, it's hovering around 50-50, and so we're no exceptions. Our cells contain mitochondria, which is where respiration takes place, where we produce energy. And these used to be free-living bacteria that were then assimilated by a cell in a big symbiotic merger. So all of our cells bear the imprint of a symbiotic merger. Our very existence it comes out of symbiotic relationships long gone. And so that's one sense in which I think we can start to soften the hard edges of our selfhood. And I think that this can lead us into some interesting places, and actually that our view of ourselves as neat individuals causes a lot of problem. It serves our our systems, our systems of organization, our systems of governance, of course. You can't have a functioning capitalist system unless you have a individual acting in their own interest. And but seeing ourselves as neatly bound individuals blinds us to all sorts of things. So it's by imagining ourselves as separate from our environments that we can justify ecological devastation. It's by imagining ourselves as separate from other humans that we can justify the exploitation of other humans. So I think there's a number of problems that come from this. And it's just ecologically false, of course, that we exist independently from our environment. The scholar Jack Forbes has a great line where he says, look, you can take out my eyes and I'll survive, take off my arms and I'll survive, cut off my legs and I'll survive. But take away the air that I breathe and I'll die. Take away the water that I drink and I'll die. And so I think this really helps to frame our bodies as open systems in constant dialogue with our surroundings, and by no means separate or even separable in principle.
Yes. Brian Hoey has an interesting question. He's saying in the first page of your book, you talk about a species isolated from mining waste, which has been identified as being radiation resistant, and is the same species now found at the Chernobyl reactor site, which you touched on earlier. He's wondering, was it deliberately introduced as a way to clean up, or has it colonized naturally? And this is this theme of mycoremediation that you talk about, fungi as capturing radioactive elements and so on. Yeah.
So no, it wasn't introduced. It was just discovered there. These opportunistic radiophilic fungi had been happily making their lives in this very radioactive zone, growing into and around these radioactive hot particles. But it illustrates a point about mycoremediation more generally, which is that often the best place to look for fungi that can digest a certain thing is in a place where pollution has already taken place. So not long ago, researchers found a strain of fungus that could digest polyurethane plastics, and they isolated this from a landfill site filled with polyurethane plastics. And so it's often in these environments that we could find useful strains which could then take on and apply in different situations.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's that wonderful book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which by Anit Singh, where she talks about the matsutake, the mushroom that's very popular in Japan as an edible mushroom, and that it in a way thrives on environmental degradation. It's found in places where there are kind of fault lines created by humans in natural ecosystems. And I think that this is a very interesting thing, which you bring out also in the book, about how certain fungi really are almost, this term anti-fragile, which is sometimes used by Taleb, where they kind of thrive where things go wrong. And on the other hand, you have these kind of edge organisms like the lichens that are out there colonizing places that are not yet colonizable. Do you think that this area of using fungi to clean up environmental mess created by humans has much potential?
Yeah, I think it has a lot of potential. It's been very under-researched. There haven't been many long-term field studies, as it were, like outside studies. I mean, lots of lab work. Can this strain digest this? Can this strain digest that? Can this strain sequester this heavy metal? But it's not so simple when you're dealing with the busy ecosystem. One fungal strain has to not only hustle to survive, but it then has to perform whatever remediating role that you're hoping it will perform. And so I think a more helpful approach, and the mycologist Peter McCoy in America is working on this now with a company called Mycocycle, is to use fungi to reimagine our philosophies of waste. So rather than wait until something has entered the environment before we then decide that we need to clean it up, is to interpose a fungus between the last use of that product and the environment. So he's working on a system with asphalt roofing, which makes up a big proportion of landfill waste. And so taking asphalt roofing, not letting it go into the landfill, taking it to a facility where you can have ideal conditions for certain fungal cultures to digest and transform this waste into some valuable, some usable product, or as a feedstock for some other downstream process. So I think this bears the most promise, and will also be a good way of inviting us to make bigger systemic change rather than treating the the symptom, which is the pollutant in the environment, to treat the cause, which is the system that put the pollutant in the environment in the first place.
Interesting question here from Tassilo Franke, who is one of our colleagues. Hi, Tassilo. He says, there are many invasive species of fungi, one of which is responsible for American bats' white-nose syndrome, WNS, killing off bats in the tens of millions, wiping out entire populations. And I guess there's also the chytrid fungus for amphibians and so on. Do you see, do you see a danger if radical mycologists exchange fungal strains all over the globe?
There are dangers, yeah. I mean, there are dangers when we move any organism from one place to another. So it's something that has to happen with caution. There will undoubtedly be unforeseen effects. One thing is often the case though with radical mycologists cultivating strains which might not survive in, a lot of these strains wouldn't necessarily survive in the environment they're being grown. Like a tropical species of a psychedelic mushroom is very unlikely to break out of a cupboard in London and start growing on Hampstead Heath. But no, but it is a risk, yeah, and will remain so.
Yes. So would you have advice? That there was another question of somebody who's beginning in as a mycologist and just starting off, and was very keen to have advice for mycologists starting out, looking at a PhD looking at fungi and the microbiome in bryophytes. What would your advice be to somebody starting off in this field? What are the
Well, I would say well done for making the right decision, and best of luck in what will no doubt be a fascinating inquiry. And hard to give more specific advice without knowing the more specific questions, but it's it's great. It's a great decision. To make, and also very interesting to study them in bryophytes as well, because we can learn a lot from these very early diverging plants. We can learn a lot about the evolution of mycorrhizal relationships and fungal relationships in plants more generally. So it's a fascinating area. Yeah,
great. A viticulturalist is asking, as a viticulturalist with vineyards surrounded by forest, sounds nice. I would like to know if ecto and endo mycorrhizal networks can interact in a positive way, and what impact could an understanding of this have on agricultural practice, water and nutrition resourcing? So quite a practical question.
So endo and ecto mycorrhizal fungi overlap all the time, and it's in general it's just something that happens. I mean, say for example in a piece of English countryside, you'll have lots of trees which are ectomycorrhizal, but then all the grasses and the shrubs, understory shrubs, most of those will be endomycorrhizal or arbuscular mycorrhizal. So in principle, this is no big deal. And then, but taking a more fungal mindset will definitely change the way that one practices agriculture, and particularly viticulture. I mean, viticulture, there's a lot of fungicide used. And so if you were thinking carefully about the relationships that the vines are forming with the soil, right? And this is very important for wines. It's responsible for minerality, all these different flavors. And it's all about how the vine is interacting with the soil. And fungi are the middlemen here. They're the mediating organism. So if you're applying lots of fungicide, you're going to disrupt the passage of nutrients from the soil into the plant, and you're going to potentially change the quality of the wine. So I think there's a lot of room for mycologically forward viticulture.
Great. We have a question from Miguel Canal, who's asking, can you talk about the relationship of mushrooms and arts? Big question.
Yeah, big question. Well, there's lots of I know a few artists who are thinking about fungi and thinking with fungi in various ways, whether they're making sculptures of mushrooms or using fungal materials to build structures, or just using the decentralized logics of fungi to inform their artistic practice and the ways they relate to other artists and to the world around them. I personally find mycelium and fungi are great subjects to help me think about the way I think. and changed the way that I imagine. And so I found them artistically informative organisms in the sense that they help to break me out of some of my human-centric assumptions and habits. And so I think it's a very fertile area, and fungi play an enormously important part in the whole, the entire living world. So whatever we do, whatever kind of human we are, whatever our passions and the pursuits, we're living in a world supported by fungal activity. So it's only natural that this fungal presence would trickle into every aspect of our human endeavor.
And unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time. There are many other great questions, but we won't have time to get to them, unfortunately. I'm very curious about the future for you, as well as the future of fungi. What is Merlin Sheldrake's next project? Are you going to delve more into the fascinating world of fungi, or are you planning to go and explore a completely different kingdom, or what is your plan?
Well, there's so much to research about fungi. I'm excited to get back to some more experimentation, some more studies, different aspects of the fungal world. I'm very keen to look into electrical signaling within fungal networks. I'm keen to spend more time in forests, just looking for mushrooms. The terrible tragedy of writing a book about mushrooms that comes out in mushroom season is that while everyone else is looking for mushrooms, I'm sitting on Zooms talking about mushrooms. So I'm keen to I'm keen to set this balance straight. But otherwise, I'm not totally sure. There's so many. There's different things arising from the book. There's different creative projects arising. There's new collaborations, new, so I'm feeling it out, but I don't know with any great certainty.
Excellent. And we are really thrilled to have had this discussion with you today, Merlin. Thank you so much for joining us, and also to have it in the context of our Fungi for Future exhibition in the Biotopia Lab, which alas, we have not been able to open to the public yet, but hope that will happen very soon. And some of those who joined us today might be able to make it over to Munich before too long. I think Dora is adding, Dora Zvonyar, who's working behind the scenes with Yasmin. Thank you both very much for your help today, and Yasmin Manhart, and also many thanks to Augusta von Bayern and the Biotopia Förderkreis for supporting today's event. I think Dora is adding a few links in the chat where you can find out more about the exhibition and about Biotopia. But I would just like to say thank you again, Merlin, for a fascinating conversation. And I hope that we can continue to follow your work and get you involved as we develop Biotopia here in Munich. Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure. And thanks to all of the audience for asking so many great questions and really interesting. And we will be saving this. This will be also made available online if people are interested in watching afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, and it's a great honor to be here, and I'm a big fan of what you're doing with Biotopia, and think it's a really a fascinating and progressive project. So a great pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone, and thanks so much.